Do people like or dislike seeing 3D printed models on the other side of the tabletop? Let's talk through a whole load of real hobbyists' opinions. Hello and welcome back to Warpix Tactics, where today I thought we'd delve into the realm of 3D printed proxy models once again, this time with the emphasis on just how much these are used by the community, any trouble that they might give you, and whether or not in general they tend to be well embraced by communities and other players on the other side of the tabletop. Just for a very quick overview of what we're talking about, there's a whole bunch of reasons that people might 3D print to support their Warhammer 40K hobby these days. Either going for entire miniatures, either unique cool designs they like, either to slot in alongside a Games Workshop army, or to print an entire proxy army outright, just to scatter in some aesthetic parts or upgrades to maybe add a bit more theme to a custom chapter or something like that. Many people's primary motivation might be to save money on very expensive plastic models, and it can be a tool to make the hobby accessible to some people who can't afford it. The sheer amount of options and designs can be good for accessing miniatures for some, maybe things that are either permanently sold out, countries where Games Workshop doesn't operate, or resurrecting out-of-production models that are no longer on sale, and all sorts of other purposes for supporting the hobby such as bases, terrain, or gaming aids. There's loads of examples of these out here, some of which I've talked through in previous videos, say for example these fun Eldar Exiles, or some Space Elf Dino Riders from across the realms. Perhaps Great Eye Studios' Crimson Lords might be a good example of aesthetic upgrades, parts design that could be compatible with Warhammer miniatures, and in particular these ones could be useful enough to put some wings back on the Sanguinary Guard. Generally though, for whole miniature proxying, the idea is that people would use miniatures that are close enough to Warhammer miniatures as alternative sculpts. It's generally fairly well understood what things Games Workshop can enforce and what they don't. Plenty of scope for doing things on a similar sort of lines, even if they're not directly copying, making all sorts of futuristic human troops, or great big grimdark demons with their own designs. The idea usually seems to be that you could use them for Warhammer 40k, they could be used for other gaming systems that are miniature agnostic such as Grimdark Future. Obviously it's not really something that Games Workshop want to encourage, and often their policy tends to be that 3D printed bits just aren't generally allowed in their stores unless you've literally sculpted them yourself. Even beyond Games Workshop, other stores and events might have their own restrictions in one way or another. That's particularly local gaming stores that aren't necessarily getting any profit from allowing 3D printed full armies to flourish. Beyond Games Workshop scope though, lots of people do make good use of them, and generally for gaming purposes they need to be visually clear as to what they're meant to represent, as if not then you're not really being fair to your opponent, and it could just be hard to decipher what's going on the other side of the table, never mind try and have in-game tactics against it. Also generally for tournaments, the right silhouette and base size is required, so you're not gaining advantages by say being able to hide a model where you wouldn't normally be able to. For this video though, I thought it could be interesting just to take a temperature check of people's attitudes to 3D printing and how widely it's used. I did this by asking a poll to 2,000 people on the channel, without showing that it was 3D printing on the cover of it, just to try and get a fairly good representation of the 40k hobby as a whole, as opposed to just tailor it to the people who have interest in it. To start us off, I thought I'd ask a couple of baseline questions. 91% of people responding said that they are active 40k players, so good to know that the vast majority of people answering the questions are playing and gaming currently. Out of a random cross-section of the Warhammer 40k community, it looks like at least a fair few people have good access to a 3D printer. Whereas this one, it looks like around about a quarter or so of people actually own a 3D printer outright, and then a further 20% or so don't necessarily own one but have easy access to one, which I guess could be via friends, family, or maybe 3D printing facilities in the community. And between all that, it certainly looks like the technology's made a big impact on the hobby in general. Around about half of people are able to print things themselves, plus of course I guess you could use things like print-on-demand services out there. Before we move on to 3D printing usage and attitudes though, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Elegoo. They're one of the leading makers of 3D printers. I've generally had a lot of respect and trust for their machines for quite some time now, though there are plenty of other good brands available of course. In general their machines do tend to get good use from Warhammer hobbyists though. Unless you print in terrain or really big things, it generally tends to be the resin printers that you want rather than the FDM. I've got a whole load of different options for them at various different price points depending on all the bells and whistles, and shipped to much of the world. You can find them linked in the video description if you'd like to check them out. For a brief idea of their range for machines used by hobbyists, maybe the Mars 5 one could be a good example of a basic entry 3D printer, $180 or £170 or €180 at time of recording. Even on the smaller and cheaper machines, they still tend to have very good resolution, making miniatures come out nicely. The build volume on the Mars 5 one is a little bit smaller than some though, so you might need to print bigger things in slices potentially. The Mars ones in general have been pretty great as a basic entry 3D printer. Otherwise, for their other options, there's the Saturn 4, which is basically the same thing, with quite a lot bigger build volume, able to do a lot more miniatures or bigger ones within one run. The price does go up a bit for these ones at more like $300 or £270. Then also they do have some models that cater towards the top of the range as well, such as the Saturn IV Ultra 16K one, which is on pre-order right now. This one's up at $500, but boasts a few other fancy features. In theory it has better resolution, but I feel like the others are already pushing the boundaries of what people care about. It does have a handy feature of a heated resin tank to keep the resin at 30 degrees C, which is helpful for printing in colder climates, plus a camera with a little light built in. You can do time lapses or detect defects, and a few other fun things that aren't on the simpler ones. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. As usual, the usual caveats for 3D printing safety apply. Basically needing to handle the resin with care and keep the machine running in a well-ventilated room which not everyone has access to. Plus getting going and maintaining a printer might take a bit of time, effort and troubleshooting. Big thank you to them for sponsoring this one though. You can find them linked in the video description. In any case though, getting back to people's attitudes to 3D printed miniatures, I thought it might be interesting to establish what sort of levels the average hobbyist tends to use 3D printing at. It seems like across the board there's really quite a big mix. It does still look like the vast majority of hobbyists out there don't go down the full hog of printing out entire armies worth of models. Only around 5% of Warhammer 40K players said that they have those. But there's definitely ranges of proxies out there that can certainly do that. I've seen some of those about on the tabletop from time to time. Going down from there, 13% of people said that they either use entire units printed or very heavy use of bits and parts to customize their miniatures. About a third of people said they use things more sparingly than that, occasional use of 3D printed models or bits and parts to customize stuff, and then still a good chunk of the hobby that largely doesn't really use it too much, saying just either one or two 3D printed models or parts but largely don't use them, or have literally zero 3D printed parts in their collection whatsoever. In general, it does still seem that the vast majority of people are broadly sticking to, say, Games Workshop plastic for playing their Warhammer 40k armies. Around a good 20% of people go for 3D printing in at least a fairly big way, and a fair few more beyond that like to make use of some choice aesthetic upgrades or individual miniatures. As mentioned before, there's definitely plenty of other applications for 3D printers beyond this though, things like terrain and bases and things. I feel like that does kind of gel with 3D printed bits that I've often seen on the tabletop. Maybe a lot of people choosing to do a bit of a hybrid approach, largely using Games Workshop plastic models for any given army or faction, but maybe printing off individual bits that might add a lot of interest or save a lot of money. Say a Space Marine army with a whole bunch of custom printed shoulder pads to fit in with their chapter, or maybe a Custodes army where they're just printing the proxies for the Forge World models as they're kind of obnoxiously priced. Maybe stretching out some Games Workshop kits by printing off a fair few more legs if you've got enough bodies and arms and things to make some more soldiers. As for another take on the same thing, this is the percentage of people's armies are 3D printed as a whole, and the vast majority of people are in the 0 to 20% kind of range, largely having things being mainly plastic miniatures, and then only a fairly small 16% of people have more than that. Around about 7% of the hobby had around half or more of their miniatures 3D printed apparently. Between all that, it feels like at least a fair few people in the hobby make use of 3D printed bits or parts, but it's still a small minority of people who really go in for 3D printing entire armies or units in droves. I guess at least part of the limiting factor are the barriers to actually owning a 3D printer yourself. And here's just a few questions as to some of the factors that might influence people not getting one. I asked people to tick all the ones that were most important to them as a major barrier that stopped them picking up a 3D printer. I think, as I would have expected, the single biggest one was the limitation on space to run in a safely ventilated area. That does feel like a limiting factor in a lot of people's homes where you can't just afford to set a room aside for a long time. And also it might not be the easiest with people living in colder climates as well, where it's not quite as easy to ventilate things and also keep things warm. Otherwise though, the two other major factors are time and money. It looks like more people are put off by the initial cost to buy a printer and set up. But to be honest, if you're a regular Warhammer hobbyist, that's almost a little bit surprising to me. I feel like it's quite a commonly stated thing that Games Workshop's big Battle Force box sets cost about the same price as a cheaper 3D printer now. So I guess it's still really quite a big purchase all in one go, and particularly one that you wouldn't be 100% sure that you'd get good value out of. And after that, it's the perception of the time and effort to learn to use one or to keep one running. I feel like whenever I talk about that on the channel, there tends to be people reporting wildly different things, some of whom had no end of trouble and really couldn't get their machine printing right or took a lot of effort to do so. Some of which just took it straight out of the box, no trouble whatsoever, and had entire 3D printed armies before you knew it. And for the more upvoted ones, it's just preferring the quality of plastic miniatures to resin, which do have their advantages. Definitely easier to do a bit of physical sculpting with them there. There is something fun about just clipping out a plastic kit and putting it together, and also being a fair bit less fragile than some of the more brittle resins out there. In general, the reasons that don't really seem to put people off is the dislike of the model sculpts available. I feel like at this point there's a ridiculous amount of cool creativity out there, and the vast majority of people don't really seem to have much sympathy for Games Workshop's models being ripped off. It seems not to be a major factor in most people's minds, probably something between the prices that they charge for them and also people making legally distinct things that have a good amount of flair and creativity rather than just literally copying one for one. And for the people who either have owned or do own a 3D printer, I thought it will be interesting to see whether or not they would have considered it overall worth it between time, money, troubleshooting, and model quality overall. In general, the feedback seems to be fairly positive. Almost half of people say that it was strongly worth it, a third of people said that it's slightly worth it, they're seeming a bit more reserved there, and then around about 20% of people say either borderline or not worth it to some extent. And my guess would probably be that it's more likely to be sort of time and troubleshooting that causes it to have problems, more so than money spent on them versus expensive plastic soldiers. Overall generally seems positive, though only around about half of people seem to be very happy to sing their printer's praises unreservedly. In any case, for all these 3D printed miniatures that are hitting the table, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at people's attitudes to them, and how much people like playing with them, or whether they've had any problems against opponents. First up, I asked whether or not you dislike playing against 3D printed models, presuming that they're nice enough to look at on the tabletop and are clear proxies for the things that they're trying to represent. Seems like the vast majority of people on this one went for neutral or no impact, so in general people don't really care too much as to seeing 3D printers on the table versus Games Workshop models, obviously with the caveats that they're actually good proxies and aren't either confusing or looking awful. Almost a third of people actually said that playing against 3D printed models is an active positive, I guess supporting the idea that you want to see more designs or more outward creativity out there. It seems that the people who are just outright against them, either disliking or strongly disliking playing against 3D printed models for their own sake, are in the minority here. Only around 7% of players actually not liking seeing 3D printed models on the other side of the tabletop, just literally for the sake of the models being 3D printed. So in general that is going to be at least somewhat few and far between, but there are still plenty of people out there, and if you are going around playing with a bunch of 3D printed models, you are going to run into them. The previous one had specified that the models were high quality and nicely done, so to look at the flip side, I thought I'd ask a similar sort of question for low quality 3D printed proxy models. I left off the positive answer for this one, as it seems unlikely that low quality 3D prints, by the nature of their definition, are going to enhance the gaming experience. Again, this one's a little bit subjective, as it's each individual person's decision as to what constitutes a low quality 3D printed proxy, or what makes a good one from the previous question. It seems it's at least 50-50 here for whether or not they're particularly tolerated. It seems like around about half of people are really going to try not to judge what people put down on the other side of the tabletop, even if it's not to their own personal taste, whereas the other around about half or so of people would say that they either dislike or strongly dislike playing against low quality 3D prints. Feels like as normal with putting down Warhammer models on the tabletop, you're going to get far less disrespect for an army that's both clear and well made and painted, and in this case well printed as well. Perhaps 3D printing is a bit more of a sore spot for that sort of thing compared with just plastic models. That's one other slight side question I wanted to take a look at, was whether or not 3D printed miniatures tended to be taken to the tabletop unpainted more so than plastic minis. And for this one I asked people with both their plastic minis and the 3D printed miniatures, you generally tend to play with them on the tabletop unpainted or to what level of painting. And it does seem that 3D printed miniatures maybe have a little bit of living up to that reputation. It seems that around about 15% of people largely put their 3D prints on the table unpainted, as opposed to more like 8 or 9% for the plastic miniatures. So it feels like there's a definite small trend there. I'd say there's more similarities than differences. It still looks like if you ran into an average 3D printed army on the tabletop, there's around about a 65% chance that it will be painted, which isn't really that much lower than the 75% odd chance for the plastic minis. I was just interested as to whether or not it sort of lived up to the often stated thing that people buy a 3D printer and then wind up printing far more miniatures that they can keep up with the painting of, or they're having a good time being at their own little miniature factory. Finally, from the perspective of 3D printed model players, I thought I'd ask a few questions as to how well models are received in a few different environments. First up, here's a rough temperature check of how well their 40k player group welcomes 3D printed miniatures. Broadly speaking, this one looks pretty positive. Around about 80% or so of people generally say their player group is receptive and pretty welcoming to 3D printed miniatures turning up on the tabletops. And out of the remaining 20% or so, the vast majority tends to have more mixed reception than being outright against them, maybe depending a bit more as to exactly how they're used, or some individual players having problems with them, but not everyone perhaps. I guess that might be between looks or general gameplay. Another thing that I've just generally heard of people being a bit hostile to is, say, someone who turns up with the latest Meta army 3D printed every single game, to the point where they might always have an advantage just due to their access to more models on demand than other people who aren't using the technology. I could see how that might create some bad feeling, even if you weren't necessarily against people using 3D printing on principle. Otherwise though, for actually playing model games in a few different locations, ask people whether or not they'd experienced any bad vibes from playing 3D prints against another player. 85% of people who did put 3D prints on the table said they generally don't get any sort of negativity, whereas around 12% of people said that it was very rare or on just one occasion. It's a fair minority that gets any sort of bad feelings from the other player with any kind of regularity. Otherwise, from gaming stores, I was wondering whether or not people had any pushbacks there. It looks like 90% of people here never had any sort of discouragement from taking their models to a gaming store, whether it's entire miniatures or 3D printed bits on other minis. Obviously, we know that the general Games Workshop policy ought to be not to allow them, though individual third-party gaming stores might have their own things. It looks like around about 10% of people have either been discouraged from playing them in a store or asked for them to be removed from the store outright. That's only 2% on the second one. I feel like anecdotally, in general, third-party gaming stores tend to be at least fairly cool about them, not drive people away from their store as a place to play. Though at the same time, I can see some people taking issue with it, and I've certainly heard anecdotes of that as well. Basically, people showing up with nothing but entire armies of 3D prints might feel a bit obnoxious there, given that you're not really supporting the store if you're not actually buying anything from them. And if that's the case, you might well not be supporting the place where you're wanting to play your war games. It's possible Games Workshop might take a bit of a dim view of massive encouragement of 3D printed proxies in their affiliate stores and discount retailers that they work with, which could maybe be another factor. In general though, for store owners themselves, it maybe feels like it's less likely to be a major thing for the players who are, say, still mainly using plastic miniatures and then using the odd 3D printed bits to supplement them or make them look cooler. They're still likely to be spending a good amount of money there. Finally, I thought I'd ask the same sort of thing for tournaments or events. Have you tried to take 3D printed models to a tournament or event and been forbidden from playing them or asked to remove? And again, for this one, I'm again presuming that they're good proxies for the things that they're trying to represent, otherwise there's kind of good reason for them not to see play. It looks like only around 5% of people have reported having issues, having their miniatures forbidden on at least one occasion. For this one again, it's really going to depend on the tournament organiser and their judgment calls. Generally, if things are clear proxies, the right size, and you make sure that you explain to your opponent what's going on so there's no confusion happening, I feel like there's very unlikely to be any problems. The vast majority of events out there are at least fairly receptive to 3D printers, so as ever, any one tournament organiser could rule things one way or the other. There is often the option to get tournament organisers pre-approval for 3D printed proxies, sending in pictures and things like that. I guess that's potentially the safest way, but also raises the chance that the model could be forbidden that could have actually just been absolutely fine if you just turned up with it and not got any pushback from any opponents. In general though, if you're not gaining any sort of advantage from the models, then for the most part it's not usually a problem. In any case though, I'll certainly be interested to hear your takes on all this. I'll be interested to hear any stories of putting 3D printed models on the tabletop and people's reception to them, whether it's positive or negative. I'll look forward to hearing all your thoughts down below as always. As mentioned, feel free to check out Elegoo, who sponsored the video. There'll be links down in the video description if you did want to take a look through their range of resin miniature factories. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to check out the Patreon page, links down in the video description. That has a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early and regular votes to see what sort of things come next, plus entry to the regular prize giveaways. There's also the 40k affiliate discount links as well, if you were thinking about picking up some plastic minis. The ones below help to support the channel as well as save money versus Games Workshop's web store. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.